Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is Reading the Victorian Novel, Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. Today we will be talking about the third installment, which is chapters 7, 8, and 9. As a reminder, chapter 7, my first half at Salem House, goes over Dickens's sending Copperfield off to London to be educated. This chapter builds directly out of the educational practices of Murdstone back in Blunderston. Chapter 8, My Holidays, especially one happy afternoon, Copperfield goes back home and spends some time with his mother. Chapter 9, I Have a Memorable Birthday, throws us into some of our first experiences with death as we learn of the death of Clara and David's unnamed brother. Notice that use there of the possessive adjective. So we have my first half, my holidays. So Copperfield starting to come into a sense of perhaps ownership in some interesting ways, and then declaring a birthday as he starts demarcating his life in a progression of years. In today's video, some of the topics that I will be going over is we'll start by looking at a Dickensian technique, namely of repetition, specifically one form of repetition called anaphora. And I'll also introduce the idea of a simile. We've seen similes, people are familiar with similes, but it's good to sometimes recognize just how ubiquitous, that is, all over the place, they are in Dickens's prose. Then I'm going to introduce a term called the historical present, something that I also like to call the vivid past, which is a narrative technique of switching into the present tense while describing past events. We'll close read a passage from Clara Peggotty, and I'll try to offer a defense of her. And at the same time, I will lightly critique what the notes have to say about that passage, and then also maybe speak to the notes in general. Two small pieces of historical context I'll bring up. I won't be analyzing them or explaining them thoroughly, but I will show you that these are moments in the text that you could put some pressure on and maybe explore your own personal interest. And then we'll look at a class confrontation between Steerforth and Mr. Mell, and end on a few bits of gender, specifically feminizing of David. And there'll be a surprise about a big piece of, not a big piece, but a fun piece of Dickensiana this past week. So let's get started. Anaphora is a specific form of repetition where we repeat the same word or phrase at the start of successive clauses or sentences or even paragraphs. So you might know alliteration, which is where you repeat successive letters at the beginning of words. But here, what this does, and as you can already see in my bolding, is it's a way of structuring clauses. And Dickens, in these early portions of Copperfield, really loves to use an anaphora in order to create a collage of memory as one image builds upon the other. This comes at the end of chapter 7 on page 117 in the Penguin. The rest of the half year is a jumble in my recollection of the daily strife and struggle of our lives, of the waning summer and the changing season, of the frosty morning when we were wrung out of bed and the cold, cold smell of the dark nights when we were wrung into bed again, of the evening schoolroom dimly lighted and indifferently warmed, and the morning schoolroom, which was nothing but a great shivering machine, of the alternation of boiled beef with roast beef and boiled mutton with roast mutton, of clods of bread and butter, dog's-eared lesson books, cracked slates, tear-blotted copybooks, canings, rulerings, hair cuttings, rainy Sundays, sweat puddings, and a dirty atmosphere of ink surrounding all. So the passage is remarkable for a number of things. What I'm focusing on is that use of the phrase of the. It kind of builds a, not necessarily banality, but a buildup of the commonplace. Like these things happened all of the time, one after the other accumulated. And really that is what anaphora accomplishes, is it's a sense of accumulation. Sometimes you can break the anaphora and that's a moment of really exciting like narrative release. This is not a situation where we are doing that. A couple of other just gentle things that Dickens does that's interesting. We have boiled beef to roast beef, boiled mutton to roast mutton. So that movement of boiled roast, adding to this sense of repetition and alternation, but never excitement, nothing that ever breaks us completely out of this mold. So a simile, a comparison using like or as. We have just a couple interesting ones here. They don't necessarily introduce anything revolutionary, but I want you to kind of be aware of recognizing them when you come across them. So I just want to make sure I cover them. Here in chapter 7, school began in earnest next day. A profound impression was made upon me. I remember by the roar of voices in the schoolroom suddenly becoming hushed as death, when Mr. Creakle entered after breakfast and stood in the doorway, looking round upon us like a giant in a storybook, surveying his captives. So I've already even missed catching another simile in this passage with hushed as death. An interesting idea here, because the end of this installment will end with a death. And so here we are, like, with that simile, we're laying a little bit of the texture through which this installment will build itself. The simile that I marked, though, is like a giant in a storybook, because this is also going to be the chapter where David shifts from reading for his own kind of salvation from the trauma at the Blunderstone to storytelling as another kind of survival, wooing almost Steerforth's protection as he recollects and retells those same stories. And so here we get that idea of, like a villain in a book, the same narrative structures that Copperfield will be repeating throughout chapter 7. Like a giant might also have a touch of David versus Goliath here, David versus Creakle, and then any giant automatically also activates the resonance of David and the Jack and the Beanstalk. So the idea of maybe the giant has something at the top. This will not be that kind of giant, though. And then in chapter 8, David has returned home. I will have a respectful, prompt, and ready bearing towards myself, he continued, and towards Jane Murdstone, and towards your mother. I will not have this room shunned as if it were infected at the pleasure of a child. Sit down. He ordered me like a dog, and I obeyed like a dog. Here we have the use of a simile that actually builds out of what we talked about last week, which was the dogification of David. So you'll remember in the last installment, we had Murdstone say, "What do I do with an obstinate horse or dog? I beat him." David then being confused for a dog with the placard that's placed upon him, and then the game that is played of calling him Towser. And here he almost absorbs that doggish quality, saying, like, I did not stand up to Murdstone. And this is coming after Steerforth had stood up in David's eyes so admirably to Mr. Mell. So we have David kind of dehumanizing himself at this moment. This is the elder David commented on younger David's self. So the historical present, or the vivid past, which is another phrase that I like to use, is using the present tense to describe past events. And so in these paragraphs, what we have is the announcement of the death of Clara, or not the announcement, but the recognition of the body. And so in bold, I have put the past tense verbs, which is the norm for the Copperfield narration. In the underline, I have put the author Copperfield kind of interjecting himself with a narratorial intrusion. And then in the purple highlight, what I have here is the switch to that vivid past, that historical present. In these days before the funeral, I saw but little of Peggotty, except that in passing up and down stairs, I always found her close to the room where my mother and her baby lay, and except that she came to me every night and sat by my bed's head while I went to sleep, A day or two before the burial, I think it was a day or two before, but I am conscious of confusion in my mind about that heavy time, with nothing to mark its progress. She took me into the room. I only recollect that underneath some white covering on the bed, with a beautiful cleanliness and freshness all around it, there seemed to me to lie embodied in the solemn stillness that was in the house, and that when she would have turned the cover gently back, I cried, "Oh no, oh no," and held her hand. If the funeral had been yesterday, I could not recollect it better. The very air of the best parlor, when I went in at the door, the bright condition of the fire, the shining of the wine in decanters, the patterns of the glasses and plates, the faint, sweet smell of cake, the odor of Miss Murdstone's dress and our black clothes. Mr. Chillip is in the room and comes to speak to me. "And how is Master David?" he says, kindly. And the passage continues with this same present tense. So notice how we kind of activate the first present tense with the dashes in that first paragraph that I've copied. They set off that narrator. Then we have the past tenses as well. And so then we get a new paragraph though. And here we enter into the hypothetical, if I could not, and then we get this really marvelous bit where we only have one verb. The very air of the best parlor, when I went in, and we don't really do anything with that. What we're getting is just the recollection, and we have smatterings of impressions. So he recollects the air, he recollects the bright condition, and we build up each of these sensations, really using the definite article there, the, lending a small element of specificity before we end the memory of the kind of objects and the impressions, and we reintroduce Mr. Chillip. He is in the room. Now we've entered vividly into that past moment as we experience the cognizance of this death. So one of the things that the vivid past does is it is particularly effective when describing some traumatic moments. So keep your eye out for it. Dickens is doing a lot with it in these early chapters of David's youth. All right, here's the passage that I would like to close read. It's a longer one than we've seen, but that's to kind of give us a little bit more context. The passage is an exchange between Clara Peggotty and Clara Copperfield. We haven't really talked about that doubling of the name. It has to do with kind of a maternal doubling, but we might touch on that later on, although that's unlikely because Clara Copperfield is dead at the end of this installment. So I'll read this and then we'll kind of talk about it a little bit. But as I read, I want you to mark what I've kind of highlighted here. And specifically, I want to suggest that Clara Copperfield is not as silly as people tend to say. "You do, Peggotty," returned my mother. "You never do anything else except your work. You are always insinuating. You revel in it. And when you talk of Mr. Murdstone's good intentions—" "I never talked of them," said Peggotty. "No, Peggotty," returned my mother, "but you insinuated. That's what I told you just now. That's the worst of you. You will insinuate. I said at the moment that I understood you, and you see I did. When you talk of Mr. Murdstone's good intentions and pretend to slight them, for I don't believe you really do in my heart, Peggotty, you must be as well convinced as I am how good they are, how they actuate him in everything. If he seems to have been at all stern with a certain person, Peggotty, you understand, and so I am sure does Davy, that I am not alluding to anybody present. It is solely because he is satisfied that it is for a certain person's benefit. He naturally loves a certain person on my account and acts solely for a certain person's good. He is better able to judge of it than I am, for I very well know that I am a weak, light, girlish creature, and that he is a firm, grave, serious man, and he takes said my mother, with the tears which were engendered in her affectionate nature stealing down her face. He takes great pains with me. And I ought to be very thankful to him and very submissive to him, even in my own thoughts. And when I am not, Peggotty, I worry and condemn myself and feel doubtful of my own heart and don't know what to do. Clara Copperfield is a woman suffering extreme domestic abuse that is both mental and physical. She is a woman who falls back on claims of innocence, girlishness, and ignorance as a means of protection. And so what we see in this exchange, I think, is her attempt to get Peggotty to back down just a little, because Clara knows that it's Clara's body that's at stake when Mr. Murdstone gets angry, especially if David is not there to take some of that attention away. And so we have this moment here that begins kind of at the top of, it's very little speech markers. We have return my mother, said Peggotty, and return my mother. Otherwise, it's really just this spoken act. And so Clara Copperfield begins, and when you talk of Mr. Murdstone's good attentions, dash, and what that dash indicates is that Peggotty is interrupting, kind of, I never talked of him, she says. No, but you insinuated. And what we have here is Dickens almost marking to the reader, pay more attention, right? What is being insinuated? What is being left unsaid, but still spoken, right? Because a lot of this material operates at two levels of discourse, because young David doesn't know what's being said. David, the author, does, in the same way the readership is hearing different things. And so being aware constantly of these multiple levels of discourse and understanding will really help enrich some of the complexities of this exchange that otherwise can maybe make a reader dismissive of Clara Copperfield in a way that I think is unfair. And so where I want to look is in particular this sentence here about a certain person. So I'm going to read this again and kind of talk about it as I go through. If he seems to have been at all stern with a certain person, Peggotty, dash. So here's our first introduction to Clara. I would argue speaking both about herself and of little David. In speaking about herself as a certain person, she's able to distance Clara Copperfield from Clara Murdstone, I think, in an interesting way. The girlish, innocent creature that she would call herself, who existed before Murdstone came into the life. And now, in order for her to even really talk about herself in this role, she has to distance it, turn herself into a third person. Then we get this another dash, Peggotty, dash. You understand, here we have this marker. You're paying attention, Peggotty, that we're talking on multiple levels. And so I am sure does Davy. No, David does not at all. That I am not alluding to anybody present. She protests too much. She's completely talking about herself and David that are present. But we now have that act of plausible deniability. It is solely because he is satisfied that it is for a certain person's benefit. He naturally loves a certain person on my account, right? That little aside being like, maybe I'm talking about David here, and acts solely for a certain person's good. So here we have repetition, not anaphoric repetition, just repetition, whereby a certain person is suddenly the certain person. And so this is a reason to kind of pay attention to what might be happening here. And it leads up into this really kind of elegant sentence structure. I very well know that I am weak, light, and girlish creature. So there we have three elements, right? And he is a firm, grave, serious man. So weak and firm are paired, light and grave, which is so good, right? Light being life, grave, serious, but also the grave. His name being Murdstone, her name being Clara, a lightness, and then girlish to serious. And this amazing moment here with, and he takes, and then we enter the speech act. This is what is called a suspended quotation, a work admirably studied by a scholar named Mark Lambert and also by the online forum Click Dickens, in which you interrupt a speech or a sentence of spoken word with a statement of what's going on by the speaker. And he takes, and the sentence is allowed to rest there. Murdstone does take. He takes and he takes and he takes. To quote Fences, he doesn't even know he's taking. We then finish this moment, but pay attention here. Said my mother with the tears which were engendered in her affectionate nature, stealing down her face, right? She's just had a baby, so we have an interesting thing with engendering. We have stealing, we have this kind of like, Murdstone is the person stealing youth from her. He takes great pains. Yes, he does. He causes her great pain with me. And then we have this victim mentality. I ought to be thankful to him. I ought to be thankful to him for his abuse. I ought to submit to him even in my thoughts, right? I can't rebel. She is a woman so beaten down by the domestic terror that Murdstone has enacted in Blunderstone that she's desperate to survive in any way she can. This is not an approach to Clara that many people share. They're swift to write her off. Unfortunately, one of the people that does this is the editor of the Penguin, Jeremy Tambling. So in response to the end of this paragraph, he has a note. Clara Murdstone's evasiveness is echoed by Mr. Doritz, another unsatisfactory parent in Little Dorrit, Book 2, Chapter 19. So there's a lot of reasons why this note is frustrating. Mr. Doritz is a very different parent than Clara. He is first and foremost a man, a patriarch, delusional, often poignant. He has a brother. He has children that are grown and helpful. He has Amy Doritz at his side helping out. And also Clara Murdstone is not being evasive. She's being a survivor. So an offhand comment like this, pointing you to another book that it's very likely the reader will not have read or be familiar with, is frustrating in the extreme in how it removes the seriousness of what's happening to a woman in a Dickens novel. And when there are so few women in Dickens novels that have the importance of like a mother figure, I think it does short shrift to this. Plenty of the notes are good. I don't want to take away from the whole project. I think there could be more, but in particular, when the note is at the point of interpretation like this, where it points a false parallel, this is where it gets dangerous, and also where it's important to be critical of a note, right? Don't just accept them all as some kind of capital T truth. His own note on notes is, quote, the notes comment on points of interpretation, refer to material that Dickens deleted at a draft stage, and attempt to gloss passages whose difficulty is more than just a matter of the reader consulting the OED, Oxford English Dictionary. The notes are excellent at the material that Dickens deletes at the draft stage. They are really marvelous for that. Sometimes they're good at the glossing. Many passages that ought to be glossed are not. And it is at the level of the points of interpretation that I think this edition is particularly weak in the notes. So let's jump to a couple of historical events that you can look at here, not events, issues in the 19th century. The first is the exchange at Salem House around education. Since you expect me, Mr. Creakle, to justify myself, said Steerforth, and to say what I mean, what I have to say is that his mother lives on charity in an almshouse. I apprehend If you come to that, said Mr. Creakle, with his veins swelling again, bigger than ever, that you've been in a wrong position altogether and mistook this for a charity school. Mr. Mell, if you please, will part. The sooner the better. So here we have these two issues that I put in bold: almshouse and charity school, issues of Victorian charity that are worth thinking about and through, because Creakle and Steerforth have these kind of delusions of grandeur about the kind of school that they're at, a fee-paying school rather than a charitable institution. And so this is the kind of thing, for those that are interested, where you would look into Dickens and education. And you would be thinking as well, if you're interested in novels, about Nicholas Nickleby, which is a really important one to compare, and Hard Times, and Our Mutual Friend, and Dombey and Son. It's really all over. Another one that we have is science. And this is a pretty interesting one, kind of slid into the side in chapter 8 around the idea of like gene inheritance. I declare, said my mother gently, they are exactly alike. I suppose they are mine. I think they are the color of mine, but they are wonderfully alike. What are you talking about, Clara? Said Miss Murdstone. My dear Jane, faltered my mother, a little abashed by the harsh tone of this inquiry. I find the baby's eyes and Davy's are exactly alike. Clara, said Miss Murdstone, rising angrily, you are a positive fool sometimes. My dear Jane, remonstrated my mother. A positive fool, said Miss Murdstone. Who else could compare my brother's baby with your boy? They are not at all alike. They are exactly unlike. They are utterly dissimilar in all respects. I hope they will ever remain so. I will not sit here and hear such comparisons made. With that, she stalked out and made the door bang after her. So here, really interesting, right? This idea of Miss Murdstone, Jane's Murdstone's offense coming from the fact that she doesn't want there to be any similarity in these two men, these two boys. Rather, the genes of Mr. Murdstone are the dominant genes that create this dissimilarity. So looking further into issues of Victorian thought on trait inheritance can be really rewarding in the change in ideas that were happening in science. We're still a few years out of the time of Copperfield from Darwin, but there are ideas percolating. So spend time looking into that if you're interested. And then let's look a little bit at class here. One of the issues between Steerforth and Mell is around this issue. The cruelest thing Steerforth says is, I don't give myself the trouble of thinking it all about you, said Steerforth coolly. So I'm not mistaken, as it happens. And when you make use of your position of favoritism here, sir, pursued Mr. Mell, with his lip trembling very much, to insult a gentleman. What? Where is he? Here, said Steerforth. Here somebody cried out, shame! J. Steerforth, too bad! It was Traddles. So the conflict here is around that word gentleman. Mr. Mell is using it to refer to an adult that is polite. Steerforth, though, is a gentleman in class. That is, he's an upper class gentleman. And so his offense that he takes is at a poor person making this claim. All right, we're now going to look at 3 quick passages around gender. And in order to understand where we're coming from, we actually have to jump to the end of installment 2, chapter 6. Good night, young Copperfield, said Steerforth. I'll take care of you. You're very kind, I gratefully returned. I'm very much obliged to you. You haven't got a sister, have you? Said Steerforth, yawning. No, I answered. That's a pity. If you had had one, I should think she would have been a pretty timid little bright sort of girl. I should have liked to know her. Good night, young Copperfield. Good night, sir, I replied. I thought of him very much after I went to bed and raised myself, I recollect. to look at him where he lay in the moonlight with his handsome face turned up and his head reclining easily on his arm. So what we have here is something called the triangulation of desire, whereby a man expresses his liking for another man via a interest in a third person, which is a woman. So they each take their desire through it. Here we have two youths, and so Steerforth invents this desire for a sister because he has to sublimate his attraction to Copperfield. We get a really fascinating instance of this further feminizing of David in what follows. And also like picking up, right? You'll remember from that previous passage that Aunt Betsy also has this idea of a hypothetical sister, or thought that David was going to be born a woman. So we have kind of like alternative feminizing of David, this existence of another child that doesn't actually exist. And when we actually got another David, it was another boy. So that's also fascinating. Then I tell you what, young Copperfield, said Steerforth, you shall tell them to me. These are the stories that Copperfield had read. I can't get to sleep very early at night, and I generally wake rather early in the morning. We'll go over them one after another. We'll make some regular Arabian Nights of it. I felt extremely flattered by this arrangement, and we commenced it into execution that very evening. What ravages I committed on my favorite authors in the course of interpretation of them. It was a tiresome thing to be roused, like the Sultana Scheherazade, and forced into a long story before the getting up bell rang. But Steerforth was resolute, and as he explained to me in return my sums and exercises and anything in my tasks that was too hard for me, I was no loser by that transaction. Let me do myself justice, however. I was moved by no interested or selfish motive, nor was I moved by fear of him. I admired and loved him, and his approval was return enough. It was so precious to me that I look back on these trifles now with an aching heart. So the use of the Arabian Nights here is going to be interesting in a few different ways, because in some ways it others, even almost orientalizes Steerforth. So Steerforth says, we're going to make some regular Arabian Nights of it. This is going to turn Steerforth into the Sultan. So he makes this command, you shall tell them to me, I can't sleep. And this imitates the relationship between the Sultan and Scheherazade, whom he says, I will kill you unless you tell me the story, and goes on for 1,001 nights, right? Before then being like, okay, I'm wooed, we can get married. Dickens plays a little bit with this discourse here by using the word execution and ravage. A ravaging, an execution, right, is a sanctioned killing by the state, but a ravaging is both a destruction of property, but also a word that is tinged with sexual violence. And so then when David compares himself to the Sultana, he's making explicit this kind of feminizing of himself. He's now taking part in that. And he's also acknowledging the dangers that are present because he did read these stories earlier. And so we have this idea of the erotics of storytelling and who commands a story, all of which, of course, is interesting to us because we are reading monthly installments. So as young Copperfield doles out installments of stories to Steerforth, Dickens doles them out to us. So a lot of really complicated thoughts about gender storytelling, audience that pay off. And then we get a slight shift in some of this use of female language for men. So far when we've seen it with Copperfield, the feminizing of him seems to be along an erotic level, whereas when it happens in this scene I'm about to read, it is at a level of misogyny and bullying. So this is after the firing of Mel. Poor Traddles, who had passed the stage of lying with his head upon the desk and was relieving himself as usual with a burst of skeletons, said he didn't care. Mr. Mel was ill-used. Who has ill-used him, you girl? Said Steerforth. Why, you have, returned Traddles. What have I done? Said Steerforth. What have you done? Retorted Traddles. Hurt his feelings, lost him his situation. His feelings, reported Steerforth disdainfully. His feelings will soon get the better of it, I'll be bound. His feelings are not like yours, Miss Traddles. As to his situation, which was a precious one, wasn't it? Do you suppose I'm not going to write home and take care that he gets some money? Polly? So those three moments, calling him you girl, Miss Traddles, and Polly, all act to demean traddles, to insult him. Whereas before, we had kind of seen this admiration of the feminizing. And so this is just kind of to show, right, like gender in Dickens is not a one-to-one ratio. It takes complexity, it takes thought, and it takes unpacking. So spend time with it. And then lastly, we're going to look at this illustration. I chose this one rather than the schoolhouse one because it's maybe a little less commented on. But let's notice a couple of things here. David Copperfield for the first time is standing up and passing into a door. He is, however, passing back into a door of his home. So instead of crossing a liminal space and going outward, he is returning. He is facing the back of a chair. So this idea of lack of access. Behind him is a grandfather clock. So we have pressure of time behind him, also aging, but its very term grandfather clock is about the idea of inheritance. In a Dickens novel, having a grandfather clock is extra important because of Dickens's history with the Old Curiosity Shop and Barnaby Rudge, which were printed in a short-run periodical called Master Humphrey's Clock. We have kind of an erotics of the female body here, the maternal body, where it's both innocent suckling at the breast, kind of Mary, Mother of Jesus, but also we're asked to, I think, consider the more erotic aspect because we have the very vast décolletage of this woman above who's kind of side-eyeing, showing her slim waist and large breasts, looking to the side. So, oops, spoiler. There's a sense of something spilled here, what seems to be a purse or maybe the sewing kit spilling out. And then we have two biblical stories on the side. So on the left-hand side, what we have here is the prodigal son, the biblical story of the boy that squanders his inheritance and returns home and is forgiven. There might be characters that this compares to, whether it is Copperfield or not, remains to be seen. And on the other side is Moses being placed in his basket and sent away. So two very different versions of biblical childhood that we might keep in mind. And as we kind of finish up, I'll just share one of the great delights from Dickens' Twitter this past week. Here we had Sarah Parker making toilet roll Charles Dickens's. And in this one, we have an image of Dickens himself as a kind of older figure, Dickens the youth, the time of Nicholas Nickleby, here Grip the Raven, and then I've blown up on the side the very charming, handsome young Dickens the author. And with that, I wish you the best of reading as you begin the next section. So we will see you in the future.